Welcome to the Engaged Jain Studies Podcast, brought to you by Arihanta Institute. Listen to top figures in the fields of Jain studies, religious studies, vegan studies, and social justice discuss pressing issues of everyday relevance. Together, let's move beyond the realm of personal spiritual growth and connect philosophy, religion, and spirituality to the important task of caring for the well-being of society. Learn about your world and how to change it on the Engaged Jain Studies Podcast.
Welcome to the Engaged Jain Studies Podcast. I'm Professor Christopher Jane Miller, and I'm joined by my colleague, Professor Jonathan Dickstein here at Arihanta Institute. And we're going to have a little conversation today. But before we do that, Jonathan, maybe you just want to tell us briefly where you were coming from right before we got started here when we were getting set up. I think it helps lead into a lot of things we're going to talk about today.
Yes, it's funny. I think when you see people on podcasts, we think like they're just been like sitting there grinding at the desk all day. But I actually had to run in because I do work with Food Not Bombs. I've been doing that for several years in different locations. And for those not familiar with Food Not Bombs, it's kind of like a loose collective of individuals internationally. It began around 1980. So we're approaching 45 years, almost 50 years of this. And it's really dedicated. It started as an anti-war movement, anti-war, pro-social support, food, medical supplies, housing, really any forms of support for anyone who needs them. So it began out in California. And I've been doing it for several years in Southern California, then in the Denver area, and now in Philadelphia. So, for example, this morning I had to get up pretty early and go out to the Philadelphia wholesale produce and pick up case after case of food. I mean, food waste is amazing. Something like 40% of all food in the United States is thrown away. When you go and see these kind of vegetables and fruit, just cases upon cases. So part of our work is twofold: to make an inroads into food waste and kind of reduce consumerism, reduce excess production and consumption, but also to support the local community. So it involves a lot of sorting, organizing, cooking, and then with a whole host of other volunteers, all walks of life, the people that get involved, we distribute produce and cooked food to a local community, obviously absolutely free. Everyone is welcome. No one is turned away. And this happens every week. There are some chapters, I think, internationally, they do it multiple times a week. If we can, it really depends on capacity. But I find it to be an unbelievably important and rewarding form of engagement.
Yeah, the reason I also asked you that question is you often describe yourself as a scholar practitioner. And a lot of people describe themselves as scholar practitioners in the field. It often comes in the field of yoga studies, Buddhist studies, Hindu studies, these kinds of fields of inquiry. But the way that you practice as a scholar practitioner, to me, is quite unique in that you're really out on the street, so to speak, really trying to make an improvement of society and not just yourself. Oftentimes, the scholar practitioner is someone who's maybe just working on themselves. And it's not to say that what you're doing isn't working on you, but the level of service and what that involves and how it intersects with questions of animals and the food we eat and veganism and all the things we'll talk about today. It's really fascinating to me. So Professor Dickstein and I are going to be teaching a course together. We'll talk about that more later in the podcast. But before we get to discussing that, I wanted to give a chance for you to get to know who he is and who I am and how we've worked together over the years in various ways. So here you are at Food Not Bombs, doing an early food pickup, helping people eat on the street and really engaged throughout all the cities you've lived in. As you said, Southern California, you were in Denver, and now you're in Philly, right? How did you get to this point? Not only as a practitioner, but as a scholar practitioner, what got you to this point?
It's a great question. And I think we all have our very interesting histories. I like what you mentioned about scholar practitioner, because like you, I think years ago in yoga studies and folks in religious studies, there's the sense that the practitioner aspect is the more personalized aspect. Like I study out, that's me out in the world as the academic, but I'm also a practitioner internally. And I think I associated that way for years. It's funny, now it seems a little bit the other way around. Like the academic is kind of the not external activity I'm doing. That's like my own research and study. But the real practice is intervening in the world. I think it'd be wonderful if we can just expand practitioner to both sides, right? If we think of the academic side in the middle, then the practitioner aspect is your personal, say, spiritual practice or care practice, whatever it is, or practice out in the world. I have found for me over the years that practice out in the world is the most effective form of care for myself. But that's a different topic. So it's fascinating. Sometimes I think about this, especially when individuals have a certain image of who are vegetarians or vegans or animal people. And, there's a whole gender and racial component that we could certainly dive into, the kind of stereotype of who's involved in those kinds of lifestyles or thought practices. But I didn't meet a vegetarian until I was a junior in college. It's true. I had never met in my entire life up until that point. And that is quite late. We're talking about 20 years old. I had never met one or really even heard about it. I grew up in Northeast Philadelphia, single parent household with my mother and my brother. And my mother was a public school teacher for 3 decades. We didn't have much, but enough, right? Not like how it's much worse for individuals who really are not having much to eat and really struggle kind of in the day-to-day of starvation. But yeah, I went to fast food restaurants and I lived out of a microwave and ate all of the things that American kids grew up in, maybe in the 80s and 90s. These like touted low-fat cookies boxes where you just eat the whole box and it's okay because it doesn't have saturated fat or something like this. But that's just all to say that there was no idea. I mean, everyone around me was eating animals. Obviously, we had dogs and other people had dogs and cats. No one ever thought that committing violence towards them was right, or any kind of like wanton abuse towards other animals would be right. But I still went to the zoo, or a petting zoo, never saw any problem. I mean, this is just amazing, the amount of conditioning that can go into actually seeing animals time and time again in cages and suffering or in boredom, and it doesn't register for us. As seemingly smart as we are human beings and can notice things, we just right in front of our face can't see it. And I met a couple in college, a couple of vegetarians, maybe they were vegan. I really didn't ask, and still never really registered for me. And this is also as a philosophy student. I was a philosophy student in college and didn't really do much in animal ethics at the time. Maybe that would have affected me. I didn't take a course in animal ethics. I don't think it was as prevalent as it is now. And then I could go further into it, but got involved in yoga because I wanted to do some practice, not just philosophy, right? This was the interesting aspect. Indian philosophy seemed to offer not just this theoretical component, but a practical component. Pranayama, asana, dhyana practice. And I think like a lot of people, you just start to conform or do the things you think you're supposed to do while engaging in something new. So I saw there were a lot of vegetarians around me and I became vegetarian because I wanted to really give it a shot. And I thought that was kind of what you needed to do, to give it a shot, really practice vegetarianism. I assumed it was something had to do with nonviolence. Meat was fine. I just to another point, I was never like a huge meat eater. I grew up eating it, but I would never like relish in it or really go out of my way. But it was pretty easy. In mid-2000s, I became vegetarian. And still in the yoga tradition, I think around then you start searching, looking online, doing Google searches about vegetarianism, even vegetarian recipes or how to do this. And you start seeing things about eggs and you start seeing things about dairy, honey, horse racing, pets, zoos, horseback riding, things that I've never really came across my eye or my thought. And then I realized that it didn't make any sense. This is the key issue. It's that it doesn't really make any sense, vegetarianism, when you know the reality of it. If you're doing it for this kind of ahimsa reason, a nonviolent reason. And so from then on, I kind of switched my graduate work. My graduate work was in yoga studies at the University of Colorado Boulder. And when I started to kind of be in the middle of my graduate program there, I pivoted and I said I wanted to do more yoga ethics. Yoga ethics led me more to broader ethics. So where yoga ethics coming from? Classical yoga ethic? Well, Shramana ethics and Buddhist ethics and Jain ethics. And now I start to get really into it. And now I start to really see how I want to focus not on kind of food, but on animals and ethics we owe to others. So I'll pause there because that's how I started to make that transition to my own kind of vegetarian to vegan path to animal ethics. But I guess I'm curious, I'd ask you, like, where were you around then? How did you get to that first moment? Because we have a similar background in yoga studies, and I come across similar folks similar to us. So maybe you can add a little here.
Yeah, I'm happy to. Yeah, and we do share a very similar background, and I think that's really what we want to bring out here, part of the story of how our paths eventually converged in not only academically, professionally, personally, through the vegan world, through the animal advocacy world. And for me, I have a very similar upbringing. I grew up as a typical American young man, eating everything fast food because, again, we had a lot of food scarcity in our own household, and fast food was in our little food desert that we lived in was the only thing that was really available and affordable and satisfying at the time. And so I ate a lot of fast food. I didn't think about what it was. I didn't care if it was a burger or fries or onion rings or whatever. Just ate it without thinking about it. And it satisfied me. It kept me full. It gave me energy. Fine. As a teenager, I went to college, took a course in Indic traditions, where I was first exposed to yoga, Buddhism, Hinduism, and of course the Jain tradition, where I first kind of got inspired that ahimsa or nonviolence was even an option. And I remember my first supervisor when I graduated. I was an accountant. I was working at KPMG. She was a Jain, and so this was like by some good karmic consequence that I had a Jain supervisor for my first. And of course, most all Jains are vegetarian, and as we know, we'll talk about later, increasingly vegan. She was a vegetarian, and I started eating vegetarian with her at lunches. Got really inspired to kind of try to experiment with this lifestyle. What does this mean to practice nonviolence through what we eat? And time passed through my 20s. I went flip-flopping back and forth between being vegetarian and not. But what really happened is then I started in my late 20s my yoga training. I got involved with the yoga community, and for the same reasons, for ahimsa, for nonviolence, we were told that vegetarianism was the way. And so, as you say, there's this kind of social pressure, social environment around you that encourages you to be and eat and consume certain ways in the world. The broader consumer culture of which I had been a part never questioned what we ate or what we consumed. In fact, it promoted that kind of behavior. So I never really thought about it like you're saying. But this forced me for the first time in a major way in a community to reflect on my samskaras, my mental impressions, my karma, all the things I had been indoctrinated into throughout my life. And when I started eating vegetarian, I started to realize there are harms I am avoiding, right? I'm not eating meat, so I'm not contributing to certain forms of slaughter. I'm not contributing to certain forms of environmental degradation. And for me, that was satisfying to know that this was kind of the ground of this yoga system that I was being trained in, that it called into question these violences and these harms against the environment, against other sentient beings, and even perhaps for my own health. So this was all tied into a kind of package for us in our yoga training. And I found that to be quite inspiring. And so I was vegetarian for a very long time. And I was vegetarian when I met you. And I don't know if you remember the first time we met, but yeah, maybe you can tell the story of what was I eating, if you remember when we first met. By then you had become vegan. So maybe tell us a little bit about that and what I was eating when we ran into each other.
Yes, I remember we were both in Wisconsin going to the South Asia conference that's held annually there. And I was actually presenting on something mostly taken from Chris Framaran's book, Hinduism and Environmental Ethics, about where we get the ethic of ahimsa coming from. Like, is it related to atmans or to chittas or to bodies or something like this? But it was just interesting because that's what I was presenting on. And a lot of folks had gotten to the airport and everybody was waiting for cabs. And I don't think we knew each other. I don't know if I knew your name at a certain point. I actually had been at LMU earlier for a yoga conference, but I don't think we intersected at all. And I asked if you just wanted to take a cab into town. And we did. And while we were waiting, kind of just like introduced each other and realized like, oh, you also do South Asian studies. I do South Asian studies. Oh, you do yoga studies. I do yoga studies. And we were both in California. So it was just really interesting. I can't remember like the content, but it was just very coincidental because it could have been really anybody that we had asked to take a cab together. I know, right, you were eating M&Ms, right? But you've told me the story. I can't remember it at the time. That's correct?
That's correct. Yes, I was eating my milk chocolate M&Ms at the time. So this is back in 2018. Yes. And by then you would not be eating those. You had since then renounced your vegetarianism and had become vegan by that point.
Yeah, that's true. And what's the other part? I think you've told me the story. You're like, oh my God, I'm like self-conscious. I'm eating milk chocolate M&Ms. And I think that's a funny aspect too. And we continue with the story. I mean, the rest of the story kind of runs itself and how both of us have focused a lot more on environmental ethics and animal ethics and veganism ever since. But I think the interesting aspect of that is how much we found that even if we talked in a vegetarian context, the way that people who are not practicing those diets feel a need to kind of apologize to the other person in their presence. Like, oh, I'm sorry I'm eating meat in front of you, or I'm like, sorry I'm drinking milk or eating M&Ms in front of you. And I find it to be a very interesting phenomenon. Because why would I be in need of some kind of apology, right? It's this idea like it's either offending me or, and I don't know. I mean, maybe you have a thought about it because it seems like there's almost this immediate recognition that there is something problematic with what I, the consumer, am doing. Because otherwise, why would I need to say anything at all? And yet, on the other hand, the apology is kind of misdirected, right? Because vegan Jonathan is not being affected harmfully by you eating milk chocolate. It's more so those individuals who actually need our concern, those animals that need our concern. I don't know. I still find it to be I think it's well-intentioned. I should also mention that, I feel like it really comes from a really good place from people who genuinely want to say, I recognize might be a little bit of a conflict here. Do you get that a lot too?
Yeah, absolutely. And oftentimes people will, at conferences, academic conferences, will come around me with like a steak burrito. I remember somebody came to me with a steak burrito, a yoga scholar, and said, I'm sorry, Chris, to the vegan here. And I was like, well, why are you sorry to me? Like, it's the animal that's in your hand that I'm feeling, we should be feeling for at this time. It's not about me. It's about the animal. Yeah, but so I remember having this feeling, I'm eating these milk chocolate M&Ms. I'm discovering that you're presenting something about, I think it was like, as you said, environmental ethics, that you're vegan, that you're into animal stuff. And it really made me pause and reflect because I had been devoted to ahimsa and devoted to these principles from yoga for a number of years by that point in 2018. And I remember standing there and it was like my conscience was like just kind of sprouting up inside of me saying, here's a reminder coming to you from this person who you've met, who you have so much in common with. Maybe there's something more I can do. And it wasn't that you were trying to convince me that I needed to stop eating my M&Ms or anything like that, but something inside of me started to question that. And of course, that, along with a lot of other things, as often happens with people, it's a very common story and process where people go from eating meat to being vegetarian to being vegan. But I remember having that sort of self-reflection, which I think is important. And it's a good sign of your advocacy that, I didn't feel pressurized, but at the same time, I felt it was time to reflect. And that reflection had been going on for a while, but it really was a start of a process where a year later, I would in fact become fully vegan myself. So, yeah.
It's very tricky. I think the animal rights movement, advocacy movement, and so on has just been really trying to figure this out for decades of theories of change on the individual level and the social level. I don't think it's unique to animal rights either. We're trying to figure it out on the environmental movement, social justice movements. People will argue about tactics just as much as principles. And I think that you're right. It's just going back to something you said, I felt that way too. As someone who came from philosophy and wanted to live my values and kind of engage, not just in somatic practices, but also kind of really have a life that felt integrated. It's not like consistency for the sake of consistency. Naisargi Dave, who's the anthropologist at Toronto, I really appreciate their framing when they say sometimes veganism has this kind of tyranny of consistency problem. Like, are you consistent? Like, people will say this, like, Jonathan, you're vegan, but you fly in airplanes once in a while, or you do this other thing. You have an iPhone. And it really distracts from the issue, this consistency or like this kind of insistence on pointing out contradictions as if we could possibly live a perfect life. And the Jain tradition says it's impossible. It's completely understood that it's impossible. And so I find that to be interesting. And what it seems to have done, and I think you've come across the same frustration in yoga communities, is it swings as if we can't be perfect and we can all just choose whatever we really want to do. And I think this suffers from, I think it suffers from this misguided relationship to this problem of contradiction and consistency. But if you really wanted to blow it up, I think it has to do a lot with the idea that a religion or spiritual practice is an interior practice, and hence like what I actually do in the world is rather irrelevant. It's all about some kind of belief system or thought system or somatic practice system myself, but not really about how I engage the world. I mean, I think that's like a key component. And if we want to do this very much like neoliberal consumer capitalist critique, which I find to be just as plausible, it's that actually consumption is criticism free. That's kind of part of the contract we've engaged in, is the idea that everyone should be allowed to consume as they want, and it's almost value free. The kicker on that is, at least traditional Jainism will rebut that time and time again, will reject that time and time again, which is why I think it's very important to engage Jain values and Jain ideas in the context of animal rights and veganism, because it certainly is concerned with living your values, living your philosophy. But anyway, I could go further into those kind of ideas I brought up, but I find it relevant because I think both you and I, whether we're dealing with yoga studies communities or even academic communities, this idea that like theory is really what we're concerned with and practice is kind of irrelevant.
Right.
Or at least it's so interpretable, we actually can't make any normative claims.
Yeah, and so this idea of our academic work being value-free, first of all, is impossible. I don't think anybody's work is value-free. Even people who claim to be value-free in the academy in any regard have values, and they live them in various ways. And so this idea of being constructive is often critiqued, of making constructive claims. I've heard people, at academic conferences, whenever we talk about animals or we talk about the environment, to say, are you making a constructive claim? And why is that such a huge problem? Of course, these are debates that have been going on for a long time in the academy, but a lot of us are led to the academy precisely because we want to make a constructive claim, because we see an injustice taking place or manifold injustices taking place. So we didn't just show up here for a career or a hobby. We're here because we care. Part of what leads us there, and what we've been talking about, and kind of what I was hoping would come out, and I know you were hoping would come out in this conversation, is that we were led to where we are through our various engagements with both academic ways of studying and knowing the world, and also through studying firsthand and practicing firsthand these South Asian traditions, practices of these South Asian traditions, particularly mostly at the beginning from yoga, but then increasingly with the Jain tradition, which of course intersects, its ethical system intersects with the Patanjalian or Yoga Sutra that we were both trained in and we've studied. And so what's really happened here, I think, and what has drawn us to where we both are on our life paths in many ways, has been this kind of shifting engagement with this transnational animal advocacy vegan movement on the one hand, and the values of these South Asian religions that we ourselves resonated with as individuals and in communities. And they've really come together to, form a big part of who we are. as scholars, so to speak. Of course, there's many other things that influence our lives, but these have been two major influencing factors that I think really drive our work and inspire us to be quote unquote scholar practitioners that we aspire to be. And so out of this, you and I we've authored things together, articles and things, and done presentations together in the past that speak to these issues that we've been discussing here. And we've also developed now a new course at Arihanta Institute, a short course for the public to be able to kind of enter into this world of the Jain tradition, of veganism, of animal advocacy, of environmentalism, and what we call engaged religion. Do you want to tell us a little bit about this course that we have coming up that we're teaching that really brings these influences together? And maybe we'll go through after piece by piece, like what it is we're intending to bring to you all.
Yes, I think that's a nice way to frame it. You know, if the listeners aren't aware, Chris and I did some research and put out a co-authored article on Jain veganism, the kind of contemporary phenomenon of Jain veganism. And when we were thinking about this course together, we came to the realization that that could be a kind of course, and it is certainly part of this course. But really what's nice is kind of bringing these three components together: Jainism itself, veganism itself, how it seems to be very closely related. I mean, you have an ahimsa-driven lacto-vegetarianism already in place in Jainism, right? And so we talk about dairy because this is the last, like one of the final frontiers, you could say, for contemporary Jains who are rethinking the dairy industry. And then engaged religion in general, which we've already been talking about so far, is the notion of why it almost would seem like an oxymoron at first. Like, how could you have religion that is not also engaged in the world? But when we talk about engaged religion, right, we're really talking about taking engaged Buddhism, or what engaged Buddhism did from the Vietnam War and afterwards onward into Jainism, and understanding actually Jains, even ascetics, even people who are engaged in very deep spiritual practices, realizing that, wait, if part of what you're doing is for the sake of all beings, for their welfare, minimizing their suffering, for increasing their well-being, for helping their spiritual awareness, then how could we not be involved in that? I mean, also given the scores of yoga people who invoke Gandhi all the time, or we're talking about Gandhi, right? Who's more engaged than Gandhi, regardless if we actually agree with all of Gandhi's politics, right, or not, and that, but just someone who's really engaged all around. I think that's what we're saying. Okay, so how are Jains, and not saying Jains need to be engaged, it's how are Jains already been engaged in the world, whether through diet, through their professional life, through philanthropy or charity and giving, also through interventions. And so the course is really about how Jainism has a history of engagement with the world, but also how we see Jains expanding the realm of what engagement looks like, especially to confront problems that I personally think were unfathomable to Jains of centuries. I mean, millennia ago for sure, but maybe even a couple centuries ago. And I think that's really what the course is about. So it has something for everyone a little bit, I want to say as well. Like if you're someone who likes Jainism and don't know much about engaged religion or veganism, that's where your center can be, or your foothold. But maybe you come from veganism and want to learn more about Jainism and religion, then you can do that. Or if you want to see how engaged religion, say from the Buddhist tradition, now is being transferred, or how we are at least speaking, framing it as such for Jainism, you can come in there. So I think it's wonderful how it has a very big tent for entry, and there's something for everyone, like I said.
Yeah, I agree. So having co-developed this course with you, I know we envisioned it as not only for Jains to really take a close look at their values and dairy and these issues that vegans are already well aware of, but also for vegans and people who care about animals and in the transnational animal advocacy and vegan movements to actually see that there is a sort of religious philosophy. We can even just call it a philosophy and set of values that exists in a living tradition all the way to this day, not unlike Buddhism, for example, but with its own unique philosophical dimensions and ethical values that really resonate with vegans Most vegans have heard the word ahimsa before, nonviolence, and are committed to nonviolence. And if they said that, they would say, yes, that is my primary ethical value, non-harm to all sentient beings. That, of course, ahimsa, nonviolence, has its roots in the Jain tradition. Among these other yoga traditions and Buddhist traditions, the Jains historically, as far as we see and the evidence we have really practiced this to the utmost. And so this value and this practice, this active practice of not causing harm to other living beings of any kind really finds its roots and has a rich philosophy that's connected with it in this tradition. And that really brings us through like what it is we're going to talk about. So in this course, of course, we'll talk a little bit about what is the Jain tradition as a tradition that has rejected animal slaughter for thousands of years in the face of other traditions that were actively slaughtering animals and killing animals and consuming and eating animals. The Jain tradition has from the start rejected that practice, among many other things. So we go through a bit of that history and we talk about then what you turn over to, which is really the problem of violence. Can you say a little bit about that? Like, why is violence, we're talking about nonviolence, but why is violence the problem in this tradition?
Yeah, it's complicated. And I think about it so often, which sounds like some nerdy philosophical endeavor, but honestly, at this current state in the world, when I turn on the news and we're talking about what protest is and what violence is and nonviolence, right? There's this kind of political obsession with nonviolence where we seem to be talking about pacifism. And so now we have a weird conversation about the difference between pacifism and nonviolence. And then also the idea that property can be somewhat of a victim of violence, right? So even in English, we're just having these strange debates that have very real world consequences for people. So this is not just some philosophical foray for me. But in Jainism, right, the issue is that it's kind of hard. They kind of feed one another. It's like the snake eating its own tail, in the sense that for Jainism and South Asian traditions is where I, especially coming from existential Western philosophy, really found a foothold of my own, which was that there's a lot of suffering in the world. And the more that we have wisdom and vision, we just see more of it. And that desire and desire satisfaction is not going to end that. I really appreciate the Buddhist tradition for this early highlight. Like that latte from that new cafe is just not going to be the answer for you. Like the new place, the next one, it's never going to be the answer. And Jains recognize this as well and say like, well, okay, the answer then is to stop being reborn, right? Free yourself from samsara through moksha. But Jains also recognize that harm itself is a bad thing. Pain is a bad thing. We want to avoid it. And so what I said about kind of the cyclical nature of this is that there's the idea that being born into the world means that you will experience suffering. And the only way you can stop your experience of suffering is to be liberated. Also, being born into the world, you will inevitably cause suffering for others just by any undertaking. You can minimize it, but you can never avoid it completely unless you achieve liberation and are not born again. However, if only it was that easy, because in order to achieve liberation, you need to avoid and shed karma. And how is a lot of karma accrued? By the performance of violence. So in that way, you have to live a life that minimizes and sheds karma, a lot of which is caused by causing harm, only through which you can achieve liberation, at which point you can free yourself from both the experience of harm and participating in causing others harm. So this is the problem of violence for Jainism: how to stop experiencing dukkha or suffering, how to stop inflicting it on others, and how to perfect that in a sense by eventually, at some point, achieving liberation.
I think that's a really good kind of synopsis of the way that the Jain tradition views violence and how it holds us back from experiencing that freedom or liberation. And I always tell people that in order for us to be liberated, in order for us to be free, we have to first liberate everything else from our violence. And like, so once we free everything else from ourselves, then we are free. And I think that kind of approach to life that you've described and that's kind of encapsulated in this philosophy really resonates with why people advocate for animals and the environment and why people desist from engaging in activities that cause harm to those particular phenomena. And that brings us then to the next part that we talk about, which is nonviolence and engaged Jainism, because the potential violences that we could inflict are always changing through history and through time, but violence as an issue has never changed for the Jains and for these traditions. And so, of course, I will go through in the course at that point, describing a little bit about what it means today. What are the violences and the forms of harm that we could do a lot better on in life today and avoid, that would really be, from a Jain perspective, spiritually beneficial and also practical, right? And so that brings us into the question of how we engage these principles with the issues of today. So I'll go through that a little bit, describing what we mean by engaged religion. These principles have application today, but where, how? And that's what this course is trying to address for both Jains and non-Jains. And then, so in the second part of the course, you will go into this and you start talking about immediately, here are some of the Jain solutions to violence, kind of broadly speaking. What are some of those solutions, categorically speaking?
Yeah. So there are the initial solutions we've talked about that have to do with dietary alterations and limitations. I only say limitation in the most literal sense of a restraint, not as in something that you are really wanting to do, but you kind of sacrifice to hold back on. I mean, those who are vegetarian and vegan, I think, who see in animal products really that prehistory of violence, are not feeling that what they're doing is a sacrifice. They're not looking at it at all. So the Jain lacto-vegetarianism, also a movement towards veganism. These are solutions, individual solutions. And there's also professional solutions, not, say, working in animal transport industries, animal quote unquote processing industries, but also not, say, working in arms or other kinds of like war-making enterprises. I mean, we're talking here a lot about veganism and animals and food, but you talk to most people who are vegan for hymn-sick reasons, if we could say. Now we're talking about a host of other enterprises as well. What about greedy corporate capitalism? So while Jains do involve themselves in trade, there are restrictions on what you can do. There are excessivenesses, aticharas, that you have to actually limit what you do. So these are also solutions. You can't work in deforestation or certain relationships with water systems that are extremely damaging to sentient beings. These are all solutions. And I find them to be so instructive because I don't think Americans tend to think this way at all, right? Americans tend to think that almost my job is neutral. It's value free. It's just a job. After all, I don't do the bad thing that my company does. I just do this one thing, right? And that just speaks a lot to contemporary bureaucracy and so on. And then there's also Jain animal sanctuaries. I talk about this in my own work about the actual rescue, saving, and caring for of animals, in addition to animal advocacy and vegan advocacy that can happen at Pandrapols, Jain animal sanctuaries, but also goshalas at times. And then just, Western animal sanctuaries as well do a lot of the same work.
Yeah, it's great. We cover a lot of these things in the course. And so, of course, as we said at the beginning, we're calling into question dairy itself as a harmful industry and substance, something that Jains regularly consume. Not all Jains, many are moving to veganism. And what we're trying to show in this course is that there are many opportunities in addition to the dairy, which is a central focus, because we're talking about veganism and we're talking about the difference between veganism and vegetarianism. But there are many aspects of Jain philosophy. If it looked at more holistically and across time, you'll find a lot of inspiration, I think, for how to live a life in line with your values that involves animal advocacy, protection of animals, boycotting certain what people would consider foods that vegans don't consider foods, including dairy, and avoiding all sorts of harms to the environment. So we'll talk about these things in the course to show how it has really this holistic lifestyle that I think really resonates with many of the concerns in animal advocacy, environmentalism, social justice, and so on. And that really brings us to the next part of the course. We'll talk about plants and the environment, right? So we'll go over that. And then once we get through talking about the environment and plant sentience, which I know we'll do as well, we're also taking it beyond just this, and we're beyond just avoiding dairy and the things we've been talking about. And we start to talk about what it means to live a minimalistic life according to the Jain tradition. Because if you look again at the values alongside ahimsa, you will find values of non-possession, of not stealing, and what we're calling here non-accumulation and detachment, which is seen to be spiritually beneficial and really resonates with a kind of broader approach to life that shows that, as vegans might say, it's not just a diet, it's a lifestyle, right? So what are some of the Jain approaches to accumulation, consumption, and attachment that you present in this course?
So the ascetic ideal, and what I've seen by the ascetic, I'm referring to kind of historically to those who renounce the world, renunciants. We could also refer to monks and nuns of really any tradition as ascetics in a sense. But we see this across religious traditions. I could talk about Jainism, but even all of our images about the Buddhist monk, or even like a priest or some like old, in another tradition, it's always this idea of someone who lives minimally, right? Who has trimmed away, kind of realized that those things, those kind of possessions, accoutrements, have not helped. They've been mostly distractions. And while this might be, exist on a spectrum for individuals to adopt or not, what the understanding is that possession itself of material goods has an inherent problem to it. And whether it's the problem of misidentification in South Asian traditions, meaning like gratification of the senses, the construction of the personality around consumption, if I'm speaking too generally, just think about how people think like, I'm an iPhone user, I'm an Android user. And supposedly there's like personality traits that go with consuming certain brands. This is so opposed to what the Jain tradition or so many South Asian traditions would say about this kind of avidya, right? This ignorance of who you are and the construction of a self. So the Jain tradition is saying like, yes, the possession of objects is going to be a problem because of these false identifications, the generation meaning the production of clinging, possessiveness, fear, envy, maybe even violence as a result, like protecting your things violently. But I think it's also objects themselves, like Jain Digambara ascetics practice nudity, carry as minimal implements as possible because there seems to be a problem just with feeling like these things are needed. And so while I'm not saying everyone to kind of be naked ascetics in their lives necessarily, and nor does Jainism. We have most Jains are lay Jains living normal lives like anyone else of any other religious tradition. But what does it mean to really reevaluate why we buy, why we accumulate, how completely absurd the notion of single-use plastics and our casual use of them is? I mean, we've constructed a material that will last almost forever and we throw it away all the time. This fantasy of a planet with infinite resources that simply doesn't exist. And so our individual infatuation with material objects and constructing a self around them has led it socially, has bought into this idea of consumer capitalism and capitalism in general, in which we can have forever growth with no consequences on a finite planet. And so I think on a social level, we're realizing this with climate collapse, with completely disproportionate food system distributions, people dying of starvation or at least being malnourished, and then what that does for our medical systems. And so I'm just talking about basically a social movement towards degrowth as actually our means to higher prosperity. And the Jainism, once we take that to engage on a social level, that dovetails immediately with the values that Jains have promoted for millennia.
Yeah, and it's really interesting. We've been speaking, going back and forth philosophically, anthropologically, historically, and and pointing these things out about the Jain tradition, one of the critiques that often comes up is that whether people are Jain or not, most people in the middle and upper class just tend to over consume, to hoard. The opposite, right? It's not about degrowth, it's about growth and consumption. And as you said, one of the traits of neoliberalism and neoliberal capitalism is for people to be in control of themselves and yet consume totally out of control, well, without question. In fact, it's often seen as a kind of virtue in capitalism that if you're able to consume, well, good for you. Nobody would question that. But the philosophy of the tradition, despite the lived reality of most human beings on this planet, the philosophy of this tradition actually calls all of that into question. So we've talked about dairy, but we're also talking now about everything we consume. And when we consume as a kind of out of control consumer, it would be seen, as you say, as, according to the definition of this tradition, spiritually unbeneficial. And one of the things I like to tell people is that whether you're spiritual or not, you're atheist, whatever, that one of the etymologies of the word vow, the vows that people take in this tradition of ahimsa, parigraha, non-possession, not stealing, one of the etymologies of this word vrata, vow, is to choose. It's a choice that you make, and you're making that choice because it's an ethical value that you treasure, and or because you want to experience something, whatever that something is that all of these South Asian traditions kind of posit as possible, that is within you, and that may, depending on your religious or philosophical leanings, exist or not exist, yourself, your soul, the absolute, God, whatever you want to call it. These traditions all sort of posit that, beyond this habitual consumption, attachment, and violence that we're so conditioned to inflict, that there is something else for us to experience. And so however we define that will be up to us in our own individual experience, which the traditions would also say. But I think that this course that we're teaching really brings out new opportunities for all of us, whether we're Jain or not, to engage the world and engage with and be in the world in a way that is more not just spiritually beneficial, but beneficial for all living beings, beneficial for the environment, and therefore, of course, beneficial for us. So I'm really excited to teach this course with you. Professor Dickstein, after meeting you and becoming vegan eventually, as at least in part because of the seeds that you planted in me at the airport in Wisconsin, it's really nice to be able to talk through all these issues with students, and all are welcome to join the course. It's a public course. It will be online starting at the end of May. We'll post the details in the description of this podcast. But before we go, I wanted to ask Professor Dickstein, is there anything else you'd like to add to our discussion before we close out today?
I think I would like to end by saying that, we've been talking a bit, generally at times, and that's kind of what we're doing, introducing a course and talking about these issues. And I think it's important to recognize that when we are talking about Jain values or veganism, it's not neglecting the lived realities of individuals. This idea, go vegan, right? People say kind of just blasting its sloganeering. That's not the way of presenting it at all. It completely depends on food access. We started off talking about this, food access, how it breaks down on racial lines, gender lines, ability lines, how it's related to colonial histories. And I just want to say that this is not part of it. And in my courses, and I know in your courses, you engage this directly. But what we're talking about is a horizon point. And that's how kind of I describe it. We're talking about what do these values point to as a horizon point, and how can we engage in our lives towards that horizon point? And what we owe or what might be demanded of us is not going to be the same for every individual. We're not neglecting lived circumstances. We're not neglecting marginalization, not neglecting economic ability. But where's our view? Where's our vision? And how can we start getting to that place? And I really think that's key to both keep us honest and anyone who is on this path honest, but also to communicate to others that there is a sensitivity to the lived reality. And in conversations, it's absolutely necessary. Hopefully even in 2018, when I engaged with you, I don't know you. I don't know your story. I don't know where you are, but what I can do is share my horizon and offer support along the way. So, I hope with this course, we are adding to that trajectory and living, even in this sense, engaged Jainism, because we don't want to consent, approve of systems of violence to humans or not humans. And education is one way to intervene.
Well said. And I don't think I can put it better than that. A unifying horizon. I love that. And I do hope that our listeners will join us in engaging towards this unifying horizon. Enroll in the course, Jainism, Veganism, and Engaged Religion, or engage with us in some other way at Arihanta Institute. Reach out to us. We'd love to get in touch with you and hear from you. Thank you to Professor Jonathan Dickstein for joining me. I'm Professor Christopher Jain Miller here on the Engaged Jain Studies Podcast, and we will look forward to letting you listen next time.
Thank you for listening to the Engaged Jain Studies Podcast, brought to you by Arihanta Institute, an IRC 501c3 nonprofit California corporation. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, leave us a review on your favorite podcast platform, or better yet, tell a friend and share it with a colleague. At Arihanta Institute, we bridge ancient wisdom with contemporary living through accessible, self-paced online courses, free events, and a first-of-its-kind Master of Arts program in Engaged Jain Studies. Visit arihantainstitute.org to learn how our curriculum spanning Jain philosophy, social justice, veganism, environmental studies, and more can enrich your understanding of timeless principles in today's context. Jai Jinendra.